Whistling 5 Anarchic Productions proudly presents Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s stories, as told by Andrew Brammer. Hello and welcome. The story you are about to hear is written and told using its original source materials, scribblings and scratchings from the scrawls of Stumpy, found within Stumpy Sanderson's time capsule, which was buried in 1979 and then unearthed in 2019. The story is told in the first person, as I, just like Stumpy, witnessed at first hand the momentous events which it recounts. So let's park up our rally choppers and tomahawks and take a ride back to 1975 for Breaking Old Reliable. Back in the times of corporal punishment, during the long ago age of middle school, nicknames were given to those instruments of correction that were used to bring order and discipline to our unruly classes. There was Miss Wake's plimsoll of pain, Mr. Kemp's rod of retribution, and, most terrifying of all, Mr. Jensen the headmaster's scything, swishing stick, known simply as Old Reliable. Old Reliable was over 50 years old and had been handed down to Mr. Jensen by his own headmaster father. It was cut and handcrafted from the finest English rosewood, and when seeing its varnished form in Mr. Jensen's glass display cabinet, one could almost hear, being called out through the fog of time, the names of some of those ruffians, reprobates, and rapscallions who had received its thrashing rebuke. To many of us boys, these were great names, legendary names. Jennings, Webb, Mills, Mollison, perpetrators of some of the most daring and nefarious exploits in our school's history. Yet there were comparatively few names on this roll, because Old Reliable was only ever called upon as a weapon of the very last resort, the instrument of ultimate deterrent. And shortly to be added to this list of immortals was the name of one Stephen Brookman, a warped genius who had hatched a plan so daring, so brilliant, that his deed would surpass that of any of those rascals already on Old Reliable's roll of dishonour. It was a deed which would reverberate down generations to come, leaving future boys to speak of it with reverential awe. For Brookman's incredible plan was to break Old Reliable, to shatter, splinter, and snap it at the very moment that its wrath was inflicted upon him. This is his story, and we go back to a cold Thursday morning and to the special assembly to which we had all been summoned. Something abominable has happened to this school today. Something heinous, something monstrous. But rest assured we will stop at nothing to catch the despicable hooligan responsible. Mr. Jensen, executioner's eyes flaming within his billiard ball head, glowered across at the massed sea of sullen, silent faces that stared up at him. Flanking Jensen were his two deputy heads, Miss Wake, a malevolent multiple-chinned toad wearing Rosa-Klebb shoes, and Mr. Kemp, a lean sadist in corduroy, sporting a Hitler moustache and coal-scuttle haircut. Jensen continued, "For those of you degenerates who may not yet have heard, this morning someone broke into Miss Wake's and Mr. Kemp's offices and wilfully vandalised and destroyed valuable school property. This appalling behaviour will not be tolerated, and you can be certain that once caught, the perpetrator will be feeling the ultimate punishment, inflicted by my own hand and the trusty strikes of Old Reliable." Jensen's grim face had by now gone through a sequence of colours to traffic light red, and as he strode off stage escorted by his praetorian guard of senior teachers and prefects, no one dared to cough or whisper. Apart from Brookman, who, sitting between Stumpy Sanderson and me, nudged us both in the ribs and hissed, "We're on!" Stephen Brookman, with his Chairman Mao hair, round-rimmed Trotsky glasses and face speckled with freckles, who came top in every exam he sat, despite putting in only the absolute minimal effort, who was the undefeated school chess champion, even in matches against the teachers, and who, with his awesome intellect, should not really have been at our school at all, but whose father, as a lead journalist of the communist Morning Star, believed passionately in the virtues of the English comprehensive system. Brookman, who, despite his academic prowess, or because of it, was the twisted brain behind some of the most infamous escapades our school had ever witnessed, yet who had never been suspected of any of them. He was the boy who had laced our visiting local MP's tea with a double-strength liquid laxative, ensuring that when the honourable member rose to speak to us, elaborating upon the machinations of the British Constitution, his own constitution had emitted sounds like a burbling and gurgling storm drain. He was the boy who had locked the teachers in their staff room during a staff meeting, having first jammed the window shut, removed the radiator controls, and then, after mastering the workings of the boiler room-based central heating system, had put the heating on full blast, leaving the teachers to endure their own sweating and ultimately underwear-clad company for nearly 3 hours. He was the boy who, at the visit of the Bishop of Bedford, had devised a contraption that hooked into the school public address system, so that every time the bishop opened his mouth to speak, the hall was filled instead with the taped Soviet ramblings of one of President Leonid Brezhnev's addresses to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. Now, Brookman's plot to break Old Reliable rested upon 3 crucial planks. The first, carried out over many weeks of banging and tapping in metalwork, was the creation and production of a beautifully worked object, formed from a strange East German alloy of indeterminate strength, specially smelted to smash English rosewood, and shaped into the exact contours of Brookman's posterior. A piece of craftsmanship with measurements so precise that when Brookman strapped it in down the back of his trousers, you would not have even guessed that it was there, and which was covered in a subtle padding to prevent any suspicious clanging that might arise when it was eventually struck by Old Reliable. It was an object that simply became known as the Shield of Stephen. The second plank was the devising of a crime so foul as to fit the punishment. A method to lure Jensen into actually having to use that weapon of last resort, Old Reliable. This Brookman had achieved by breaking into Miss Wake's and Mr. Kemp's offices early that Thursday morning and, with a junior hacksaw, hacksawing in half the plimsoll of pain and the rod of retribution. The third plank was the handing over of a document to the head prefect a couple of hours after the special assembly. A document which was simply called I Confess, and which read, "I, Stephen Brookman, servant and defender of the people, hereby denounce the bourgeoisie authoritarianism of the teaching classes at this school. I thus confess to the wilful destruction of Miss Wake's and Mr. Kemp's instruments of punishment and repression. Do with me what you will. Vive la Révolution." So, it was just after lunch on that fateful Thursday, following the successful implementation of the 3 planks of his master plan, and with the Shield of Stephen strapped firmly in place, that Brookman was frog-marched by Miss Wake and Mr. Kemp to Mr. Jensen's office, where he now stood, facing the orbicular and steel-faced head. "Well, lad, of all people you would not have been on my list of suspects. But then it is sometimes the most crooked who are the least suspicious." In his hands, Jensen cruelly flexed the heavy might of Old Reliable. Outside the window, hiding in the shrubs, Stumpy Sanderson and I, key historians and recorders of this momentous event, peered through the slightly open window, our noses just above the ledge, the faint waft of spam fritters carrying to us from the nearby dining hall. With malicious menace, Jensen commanded, "Assume the position, lad!" Squatting forward, Brookman glanced to his side in our direction, giving us a quick nod of acknowledgement, and in that spine-tingling moment, when Jensen pulled back his arm for the first strike, I noticed how the birds had strangely stopped singing. Whack! The dead thud of old Reliable shuddered up Jensen's arm, and he looked down at the stick, a slightly puzzled expression on his face. Wake and Kemp also sensed that something was perhaps not quite right. With a shrug, Jensen pulled his arm back again. Whack! The same dull sound and shuddering. Jensen looked slightly more baffled, as did Wake and Kemp, and this process continued for the next 3 strikes. Stumpy whispered, "It can't take 6. Surely not all 6. Thwack! And this time a huge splintering crack, an ear-splitting snap, and Jensen found himself looking down horrified at the tattered and shattered stump in his hand, now the broken remnant of generations of order and discipline. Wake and Kemp stood aghast, reptilian lips apart. The next moments were astonishing to behold. Jensen grew increasingly florid, flustered, and flummoxed. He huffed and puffed. He coughed and spluttered, until Brookman, looking round and smirking, asked, "Anything wrong, sir?" And at this Jensen exploded, "Get out, lad! Out!" Brookman looked back at us and winked, and then turned and began his victory swagger towards the door. But just as he went to take the final steps, his left leg suddenly seemed to seize, forcing him to take a huge exaggerated limp. Then, after shuffling and dragging his right leg in a strange scuffing motion, the backside of his Delamere trousers began to sag in a horrible drooping fashion. Somehow the shield of Stephen had slipped from its position, dislodged by the force of old Reliable. Jensen, quick as Reynard, pounced. "Stop right there, lad!" He leapt across the room. "Aha! What have we here? Come on, lad! Reveal the mystery!" Fumblingly and graspingly, Brookman pulled from his trousers the shield. At the sight of it, Jensen shrieked with diabolical glee. He grabbed the shield, nodding and inspecting it manically. "Brilliant, Brookman! Brilliant! I applaud you unreservedly! Take a look, Miss Wake, take a look, Mr. Kemp, and admire this boy's genius!" And then, just as the hysteria and hubbub grew, Jensen suddenly signalled, "Order!" And a strange and eerie calm descended. Jensen now had the look on his face of someone who realises that the end game is approaching and that they are holding all the winning pieces. Slowly, he walked round to his desk, opened a drawer, and from it pulled out a velvet-lined case. Grinning at the sick-looking Brookman, whose colour had by now begun to drain from his face, he took from the case an evil-looking implement, 24 inches long and made of wicked-looking wicker. As he swished it through the air with a measured practice stroke, a hideous whistling sound filled the room. "Well, lad, you may well be the last on the roll of dishonour of old Reliable, but you will be the first on the roll of honour of its replacement. Meet Whistling Death. Assume the position, lad. Check, mate." Thank you for listening to this episode of Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories. And don't forget to listen out for Stumpy and Gang's next adventure. For further information on all things Stumpy Sanderson, please visit www.stumpysanderson.co.uk. And you can also check out the Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories YouTube channel. But before we saddle up again on our rally choppers and tomahawks, let's take a listen to the strange little song that was specially written by Stumpy to accompany this podcast's tale. This song is performed for us now by Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s acoustic archive. Let's rock! Communist genius. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dreaming your dreams, scheming your schemes, bringing down the bourgeoisie is what you wanna do, 'cause you are a communist genius, devising your plans. Red Star means you can. Raising the hammer and sickle is what you wanna do, 'cause you are a communist genius. Yeah, you are a communist genius. Chairman Mao is who you base your hairstyle on. The only Brezhnev brings you inspiration. Trusty glasses give you your vision on socialist supremacy. Stroll on, stroll on, stroll on, stroll on, stroll on, you communist genius.